Okay, so think about it this way. Like, when you're trying to keep track of a bunch of different pieces of information, maybe it's scores for a game you're playing,
Mm,
or even just like remember everyone's names at a party,
right.
or your grocery list.
Yeah.
You probably have some sort of system, right? Some mental way of
Mhm.
organizing all of that.
Definitely.
And that's actually a pretty good analogy for what we're diving into today, which is variables in Python. So we've got this article, and it's really a nice breakdown of the fundamentals of these Python variables.
Okay.
And I guess our mission here is to sort of unpack it all,
Yeah.
make it crystal clear for everyone listening, so you come away with a solid grasp of what they are, how you name them, and some of the key characteristics.
Wow.
So it's like a strong base for anyone starting out with Python.
Exactly. I think that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
At its core, this whole exploration is about how Python organizes and works with data, right? And that analogy you use, that structured way to hold things, it's a perfect place to start.
Okay.
But what's really cool is how Python sort of takes that idea a step further.
Okay, so let's dig into that step further. So the article talks about how in Python we can think of variables as objects of classes.
Right.
And data types, well, those are like our classes, right?
Yeah, huh?
So for example, they have this I5. So that means I is an object of the integer class. So, I mean, it's a little more than just a simple container.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And this really highlights a core principle of Python. Everything is an object, right?
Okay.
So when you assign a value to a variable, you're basically making an instance, an object of a certain type. It could be a number, it could be text, whatever, right?
Right.
So you can think of classes as like blueprints for creating things,
Okay.
and then a variable, when it holds a value,
Yeah,
that's like the actual thing,
I see.
built from that blueprint.
Okay.
So you have that I5, you're basically making an integer object
Hmm.
from the integer class blueprint, which
Mhm.
defines what an integer is and what you can do with it.
That's a good way to visualize it.
Yeah.
Now, the article also mentions this term identifiers.
Right.
Now, how do those fit into all of this?
Yeah, that's a good point to clarify. So identifiers are essentially the names that we give to these Python objects.
Okay.
And not just variables, but also things like functions, other building blocks in our code, right?
Right.
It's kind of like giving your container a specific name tag so you can find it later.
Makes sense.
But just like you can't label all your containers the same or use weird symbols on the tags, Python has rules for these identifiers.
Okay, so what are some of the key things that we need to keep in mind when we're naming a variable in Python?
Well, first off, it has to start with a lowercase letter or an uppercase letter.
Okay.
You can also use an underscore.
Got it.
What you absolutely cannot do is start it with a number.
Right.
After that initial character, though, it's pretty open. Letters, numbers, underscores, all fair game.
Okay, so like a combination.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the article points out there's no real limit to how long they can be,
Oh, wow.
which is kind of neat.
Yeah.
But, practicality dictates that you probably want to keep them reasonably concise.
Right, for readability's sake.
Exactly. Longer isn't always better.
Yeah, good point.
And what about capitalization? Does that matter in Python?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Python is case sensitive, so uppercase and lowercase letters,
Okay,
they're treated as different.
I see.
They have this great example, my second name versus my second name.
Uh-huh.
Totally different in Python size. So if you try to use the second one when you've only defined the first one,
Right.
Python's going to throw you an error.
Yeah, that's a classic mistake for beginners.
It is. I've made that one myself.
Oh, we've all been there.
Yeah.
Now, the source also talks about some other things that are no-nos when it comes to naming these variables.
Okay.
So what else is off limits?
Well, you can't use any of Python's reserved words.
Right.
So these are words that Python itself uses.
Right. They have specific meanings.
Yeah, for its own functions.
Exactly.
So the article gives local, non-local, and global as examples. And then also, you can't use any of those special characters.
Right, like the $sign or...
Yeah, like $, hash, at symbol, exclamation point, %sign.
Gotcha.
Even spaces are a no-go.
So it's really just letters, numbers, and underscores after that first letter or underscore.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Makes sense. Now, what happens if you try to use a variable before you've actually given it a value?
Oh, right. So that's another important rule. You have to assign a value to a variable before you can actually use it in any operations or anything. So they refer back to that earlier example, the my_n name.
Yeah.
It hadn't been given a value yet.
Yeah.
And then they tried to print it, and of course you get an error. It's kind of like, you have that labeled container, but it's empty, you can't really do much with it.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Now, if you're ever not sure if a particular name is okay to use, the article mentions this handy tool. This is identifier string method.
Oh, right.
You can test a string to see if it follows all the rules for being a valid identifier.
That's pretty useful, especially for debugging or if you're like creating variable names on the fly in your code.
Yeah, exactly.
So now that we know how to name these containers, how about we talk about how to actually put something in them?
Right.
How do you declare and assign a value to a variable in Python?
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward.
Okay.
So the article gives these simple examples like a 455 or my name equals Raju. So it's just the variable name equals sign and then the value you want to store.
Gotcha.
And it even shows you can assign values to multiple variables all on one line.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like width height equals 710, 710.
Interesting. So that's a quick way to initialize a bunch of related variables.
Exactly, yeah.
Makes sense. Now, we already touched on this, but you can't start that variable name with a number.
Right.
So the article, they show what happens if you try to do something like 4T5D6.
Yeah, Python needs that initial letter or underscore to know it's dealing with a valid identifier.
Right.
Now, one of the cool things about Python is how flexible it is with these data types. So what happens if you assign a value of one type to a variable, but then later you decide to assign a value of a different type to the same variable?
Yeah, what happens then?
Well, that's where Python's dynamic typing comes in.
Okay.
So you can actually reassign a variable to a different type.
Interesting.
And they even use this type function to show this. So like if you start with my name, Raju, and you check its type, it'll be a string.
Makes sense.
But then you can change it to my name, part 420,
Okay.
and now it's an integer.
So it just adapts.
Yeah, which is different from a lot of other languages where once you declare a variable with a specific type, it has to stay that way.
Right, gets locked in.
Yeah. Now, this can be really handy because it speeds up development.
Yeah.
But it also means you got to be really careful about keeping your types consistent because you might not realize there's a problem until you actually run your code.
Oh, so it could make debugging trickier.
Exactly.
Especially in bigger projects.
Yeah.
Now, the article also talks about what happens when you try to do operations with variables. What does it say about that?
So it basically says that, in general, operations are done within similar data types.
Okay.
So if you try to directly add like an integer and a string,
Yeah.
like in that example, 45 and B hello, you're going to get a type error.
Right.
Because Python's like, I don't know how to combine these two things.
Yeah, they're fundamentally different.
Right.
But the article then shows how you can get around that, right?
Exactly.
By converting those data types.
Yeah, so you can use functions like int and sty. So like if a string was the string 45 and B was the integer 42,
yeah,
you could do print A plus B or print A plus star B to get the result you're looking for.
So you have to be mindful of those types when you're doing calculations.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the article mentions this really cool trick for swapping the values of two variables.
Oh, yeah.
How does that work in Python?
Oh, okay. So this is so Pythonic.
Okay.
So you can swap the values of two variables, say x and y, without needing a temporary variable.
Wow.
You just write x, y equals y, x.
Interesting.
So they have this example where x is 5 and y is 10.
Right.
And after that one line, boom, x is 10 and y is 5.
It's like magic.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Super concise.
Yeah.
And readable.
Now, speaking of readability, the article emphasizes how important it is to choose meaningful names for your variables. Why is that so crucial?
Well, it all comes down to making your code easier to understand.
Right.
Both for yourself, like when you come back to it later.
Yeah, future you will thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for anyone else who might have to read it or work with it.
Right.
So using descriptive names like Mark Math instead of just M or student name instead of just S.
Yeah.
Immediately tells you what kind of information that variable is holding.
It makes the code so much more self-explanatory.
Absolutely.
And in the long run, good names save a lot of time and prevent headaches.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now, lift fifth gears a little bit and talk about where these variables can be accessed within your program.
Okay.
So what does the article say about the scope of variables?
Okay, so the article introduces this concept that variables are generally limited to this section of the program where they're defined.
Okay.
And then it touches on this distinction between local and global variables, which is a bit more involved.
Right.
But it suggests that, there's more details on that elsewhere if you want to dive deeper.
Yeah. That's a whole other rabbit hole.
It is.
But the main point here is that a variable created in one part of your code might not be accessible in another part without some special handling.
Right.
Like, think of it this way. You have a toy in your room.
Right.
It's like a local variable. It's easily accessible within your room, that part of the program.
Yeah.
But a toy in the shared family room,
Yeah.
that might be more like a global variable, accessible to everyone in the house, the entire program.
Right.
But sometimes that can lead to problems if everyone tries to play with it at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Chaos.
Exactly.
So it's like a hierarchy of access.
Yeah, that's a good foundational understanding of scope.
Okay.
Now, Python also has some cool ways to work with collections of data and variables. And the article talks about this thing called packing and unpacking.
Right.
What exactly does that mean?
So unpacking is basically taking things out of a structured collection,
Okay.
like a list or a tuple,
Right.
and assigning them to individual
So
variables.
it's like taking things apart. Yeah, exactly. And down.
They have an example with my list 1, 2, 3,
Mhm.
and then they use print my list to unpack and print each number separately. And it also shows how you can unpack elements from a string into separate variables.
Oh, wow.
And you can even use the asterisk
Yeah.
to grab any leftover elements and put them into a list.
Interesting.
Now, packing is kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
It's grouping multiple values into a single object, like making a list from individual variables.
Right.
So they demonstrate that with the profile, name, age, country example.
So it's like putting things together into a neat package.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, these are really useful tools, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Especially when you're dealing with organized data. Unpacking can make your code so much cleaner when you need to access individual parts of a collection.
Right.
And packing is great for grouping related pieces of information together.
Absolutely.
Now, what if you decide you don't need a variable anymore? What does the article say about getting rid of them?
Well, you can actually remove a variable from memory using the del keyword.
Oh, interesting.
So they have this example, A6 and then del A. And then if you try to print A, you get a name error because the variable's gone.
It's like completely wiping it out.
Yeah. Poof.
Now, what if you're not sure if a variable has been defined in the first place?
Ah.
Does Python have a way to check for that before you try to use it?
Well, it's not like some other languages where there's a specific function like iset or something.
Okay.
But the article explains that you can do something similar using try except blocks with name error.
I see.
So you try to access the variable, and if it hasn't been defined, you get that name error,
Right.
which you can then handle in your code.
So it's leveraging Python's error handling to check if a variable exists.
Exactly.
Clever.
I know, right?
Now, one last thing the article talks about is the idea of constants. How does Python deal with those?
Okay, so this is interesting because Python doesn't actually have a special keyword to officially declare a constant like some other languages do.
Okay.
And the article points out that you can technically reassign a value to any variable, even if you meant for it to stay the same.
Right.
But there's this convention in Python where you use all uppercase letters for variable names that are supposed to be treated as constants.
Oh, I see. So it's like a signal.
Yeah, like school name.
Right. A visual cue.
Exactly.
And this value shouldn't be changed.
Yeah, even though Python doesn't actually force it to stay the same.
So it's more of a programmer's agreement.
Yeah, like a gentleman's agreement.
Yeah.
The article also mentions this best practice of putting constants in a separate .py file
Okay.
and then importing them into your main script.
Right. Keeps things organized.
Yeah, and it makes it easy for different parts of your project to access those same constant values.
Makes sense.
And they even give examples of typical constants like PI, max speed, API keys.
Right. Things that are meant to stay fixed.
Exactly.
So it's really relying on the programmer to be disciplined and treat those uppercase variables as constants.
Yeah, it's a convention that helps everyone.
Absolutely. It keeps the code clear and prevents accidental changes.
Okay, so to wrap up, what are the most important things for our listener to remember about Python variables?
Well, definitely the naming rules.
Right.
Start with a letter or underscore. Letters, numbers, and underscores after that. No weird characters or spaces. And they're case sensitive.
Right, and don't forget to actually give them a value before you try to use them.
Oh, yeah. Crucial point.
And that flexibility with data types, you can change a variable from holding one type to another.
Right. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it is.
It can be powerful, but you got to be cautious.
And of course, using clear, descriptive names, and it
Well,
makes everyone's lives easier.
and we talk about that basic idea of scope and those handy features of packing and unpacking data.
Yeah, those are good to have in your toolbox.
And finally, knowing how to delete variables with del, and that convention of using uppercase for constants.
Yeah, those are all really valuable pieces of knowledge.
Definitely.
So whether you're, getting ready for a coding project or trying to understand some existing Python code,
Or just curious about how programming works.
yeah, or just, exploring
Yeah,
understanding these fundamentals of variables will give you a huge advantage.
absolutely.
It's really the basis for how you store and manipulate information in Python.
It all starts there.
Yeah.
And this actually leads to a really interesting question.
Okay.
So given this whole idea that Python is so flexible with variable types, you can change them from holding an integer to holding a string and so on.
Hmm.
What are some of the potential advantages and disadvantages that come with that?
Oh, that's a good one.
Especially when you think about working on larger, more complex projects.
Yeah.
Think about how it affects code clarity, the possibility of subtle bugs that might be harder to find, and just the overall maintainability of the project as it gets bigger and bigger. Wow, that's something to really ponder.
It is. It's one of those things that's worth considering as you delve deeper into Python.
Yeah, because it's powerful, but it definitely comes with some trade-offs.
Exactly.
Well, that's some food for thought.
Food for thought for sure.
Okay, so I guess that wraps up our deep dive into Python variables.
It does, and hopefully everyone listening has a much clearer understanding now.
Yeah, I said
Good foundation to build on.
absolutely.
So until next time,
Happy coding.
happy coding.